We're going to begin a new series this morning that I'm excited about because it gives us the beginning of what we know in the Bible as moral law or covenantal law. The Egyptians had held the Hebrew people, you remember, slavery for 400 years. Now I want you to make sure you realize exactly what that means. No Israelite who had been held as a slave had ever known how to lead. He'd only known how to be a slave. It's hard for us to imagine a society of roughly 3 million people, probably somewhere between 3 and 4 million people, who had absolutely no leadership skills, ability, background, or models for their entire life. But that was them. They'd been followers. They had been told what to do every step of the day, every step of the way. And now God takes one Israelite who wasn't trained that way, one Israelite who was trained in the household of the Pharaoh because the Pharaoh's daughter had adopted him out of a small little boat in the Nile River. And he had grown up in the house of the Pharaoh with all the privileges and advantages and education that you could imagine. And he had grown up with the kind of leadership experience that no one else in that entire community had. So when God decided to deliver the Israelites from Egyptian bondage, he went way out into the woods. And he got this one man that had grown up that way, but had been living in exile, and brought him back through the miracle of a burning bush to lead his people out of Egypt. And after a number of unbelievable plagues that proved God's existence and that Moses was God's man, Moses led them to another miracle, the crossing of the Red Sea. And after they crossed the Red Sea, he led them to the Sinai Peninsula. And 3 months after their exodus from Egypt, the nation found themselves camping before God at the foot of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is a rectangular piece of granite that soars 7,500 feet. And when they got there, this is what happened. And I think a lot of people don't realize this is what happened. And that's why I wanted to start at this point in our study together. On the morning of the third day, thunder roared and lightning flashed, and a dense cloud came down on the mountain, and there was a long, loud blast from a ram's horn, and all the people trembled. And Moses led them from out the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And all of Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord had descended upon it in the form of fire. The smoke billowed into the sky like smoke from a brick kiln, and the whole mountain shook violently. Try to picture this in your mind. As the blast of the ram's horn grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God thundered his reply. The Lord came down on the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses climbed to the top of the mountain. Now, the mountain seemed like an erupting volcano, we just read. Verse 19 indicated the high spot. Moses spoke, and the people said, "We'll listen, but don't let God speak directly to us or we'll die." Because you know from later on in the study that if God saw anyone directly, they would die. So imagine hearing God speak audibly. How would the voice of God sound? Verse 19 in the King James and the NIV say that God spoke audibly. How would that be? No subtle communication, I can tell you that much. Spiritual sensitivity was not required. God sounds out the 10 commandments from his pulpit for every ear to hear. And his voice, we can't even imagine. It must have been awe-inspiring and challenging and compelling, for when God finishes his sermon in chapter 20, verse 19, the people ask Moses, "You speak with us and we'll listen. But don't let God speak directly to us or we will die." Moses, we like talking to you. We can relate to a man. We already have seen you and been with you for a while. We're comfortable with flesh and blood, but we're leery a bit of dealing directly with the Almighty. Whatever they saw, whatever they heard, intimidated them to a great degree. And God's commandments and his grandeur and his greatness overwhelmed them. Their mountain meeting with God, along with what he audibly articulated to them, proved to be completely overwhelming to the Hebrews. They were wiped out by the glory and the majesty of God. And the people probably had that exact same reaction when Moses then brought down from Mount Sinai the printed version. They'd already heard the audible version, the printed version of God's sermon. Not only did God vocalize the 10 Commandments, he etched them into stone with his very own finger. When the Lord finished speaking with Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the terms of the covenant written by the finger of God. What would you give to be able to see those? Written by the very finger of God. Exodus 31:18 says. Exodus 32:16 says, these tablets were God's work. The words on them were written by God himself. What a sight they must have been. There's an old joke. You've probably heard it because I've probably told it. Who's the only person to break all 10 commandments at one time? The answer is Moses. When he came back down with the tablets and he saw the people worshiping the golden calf that they had made, he became so angry that he threw down the 2 tablets and broke the words that God himself had etched into the stone with his own fingers. Even then, God told Moses to bring him 2 new slabs of stone. God still wanted his people, Israel, to possess a hard copy of these commandments so that when they went into the promised land, they would have a definitive moral law and code to live by. And so God said to Moses in Exodus 34:1, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones. I will write on them the same words that were on the tablets you smashed. God was determined for his people and for all future generations to have a lasting record of his commandments. So lasting that he made special provisions for them to be protected. Later, God orders Moses to build an ark, a gold-plated box about 4 feet wide by 2 feet long. And the Ark of the Covenant would rest in the tabernacle, which was man's place of worship until they got to the Holy Land and eventually built the first temple. And God's presence would rest in the tabernacle, though his throne was still in heaven. So in a sense, the ark was the nation's treasure chest. And God told Moses to put within that box the 2 tablets that were written with God's finger having etched in stone the 10 commandments on them. Here's my point. What one sermon did God give to 3 million people from a 7,500 foot tall pulpit? Which one of God's sermons was accompanied by lightning and thunder and the earth shaking? What one sermon did God ever speak in an audible voice to a large crowd? What one message did God ever write with his own finger, then write again, twice? What one of God's sermons did he engrave in stone so that it would never be forgotten? And which one of God's sermons did he put in a box in the most holy place they had for safekeeping? The answer to all those questions is the same. The Big Ten, the 10 Commandments. Now, the Jews refer to these 10 injunctions as simply the 10 words. Did you know that? The Jews refer to it to this day as simply the 10 words, or some of the Orthodox Jews still call it the 10 sayings. Sometimes Exodus 20 verses 1 through 17, where they are contained, is called the Decalogue. I don't know if you know why. You've probably heard it referred to as the Decalogue. I don't know if you why, but if you don't, it's because deca is a Greek word meaning 10, and logos is a Greek word meaning word. So here are God's top 10 words. The Jews called them the Decalogue. There are some who believe that God wrote these 10 sayings on the heart of Adam and Eve when he created them in the Garden of Eden. I cannot prove that, but I am one of those who suspects that God wrote his moral code within them, sort of a natural law. We call it conscience. It is referred to at length in a very difficult passage of Scripture over in Romans chapter 2, when it talks about people believing from the heart the form of conscience that is from within. So I wouldn't teach that as gospel truth. I'm telling you, it's an opinion that I hold and many others hold. After Adam's sin, the conscience of all human beings became clouded, and the moral code that God implanted in man, his sense of right and wrong, became unbelievably muddled. And so that we know from the early chapters in the Bible that the further succeeding generations plunged into wickedness, and the further they plunged, the human race drifted from its internal compass, from its internal conscience, until it became, the New Testament word for it in the book of Timothy is seared, the conscience seared as with a hot iron. It was defaced. And until God came to Moses on Mount Sinai to restate and rewrite the moral code and to literally, by his finger, put it in stone, man was a little lost as to how to exactly live. So you may say it this way: Though God placed conscience in all of us when we were created in his image, beginning with Adam and Eve, he did not codify conscience until these 10 commandments. Now, understand, the law of Moses was not the only set of ethics floating around the ancient world. There were others too, but the 10 commandments survived the test of time and provided a foundational basis for even the formation of Western civilization. Most of you know that many of our laws here in America were based upon the commandments in the Old Testament. Not just the 10 commandments, but also many of the covenantal commandments. In the West, the commandments are called the fountainhead for common law. But there were others passing around during the time period. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi. That had been around for a while. But the 10 commandments were different in that they provide guidance for every single facet of life. Their application is broad and sweeping, but they're presented in such a distilled, condensed, and powerful way that sometimes when we look at them in a more succinct form, a form that has a lot of brevity attached to it, they make even more sense to us. That's basically the 10 commandments. That's basically them. Have your children, grandchildren memorize those, and you've got the 10 commandments in a nutshell. And sometimes brevity is a very good thing. It reminds me of the man who was getting married, and he just hated long-winded sermons, so he told the preacher who was performing his wedding, he said, "I'll give you $5,000 if you can perform the wedding in just 5 words and get us out of there in 15 seconds. The preacher said, "No problem, I can do it." On the big wedding day, when the couple reached the altar, the preacher looked at the groom, gestured toward the bride. He said, "Take her." "I do." He looked at the bride and said, "Take him." "I do." Took, and they were out. A whole wedding ceremony in 5 words, and the preacher received his $5,000. I just want any of you here to know that in the event you have a wedding in the future, I would be happy to perform that exact ceremony. I would. Brevity can be beautiful, and that's true of the Big 10 as well. In 10 statements, God covers every facet of spiritual and social relationships. As President Teddy Roosevelt once said, "I stand by the 10 commandments. They are bully." What did he mean? In essence, they are our final authority. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, so in case you're not, I want to make sure you leave aware of it, okay? Obviously, the founders of America stood with Teddy Roosevelt in thinking they were bully and in his support and admiration of the 10 commandments. Go to Washington, D.C., and you will find the 10 commandments adorning many of the nation's monuments and buildings. Now, I've been to Washington 3 times, and a couple of those times I have seen the very things I'm about to show you on the screen today. This is an image of the 10 commandments engraved on the floor of our National Archives. A bronze statue of Moses stands in the Library of Congress. In fact, the face of Moses is centered directly across the podium from where the Speaker of the House of the United States stands. When he is speaking, he is looking, if he's looking straight ahead, directly at Moses, who gave us the 10 Commandments. And irony of all ironies, the 10 Commandments are carved into the wooden doors that open up into the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And I've seen those. How many of you have seen those? Handful. Yet it seems that the justices who sit on our nation's high bench must come in and out through the back door because they don't seem very efficient at supporting the truths contained among them. In fact, in the most famous case about removing the Ten Commandments from the hallway of a public school, here was the reason the court gave for its ruling, and I'm reading it directly, word for word. The Ten Commandments are plainly religious and may induce children to read, meditate upon, perhaps even to venerate and to obey the commandments. I didn't make that up. Let me read that for you again. The Ten Commandments are plainly religious and may induce children to read. Well, that'd be a good start if we didn't go any further. To meditate upon, that would be even better. Perhaps to venerate and maybe even to obey the commandments. Wouldn't that be horrible to actually encourage kids to obey the Ten Commandments? Sometimes I think we have lost our ever-loving minds. I do. In America today, freedom of religion has been replaced by freedom from religion. It was Franklin Roosevelt who said, "Where freedom of religion has been attacked, the attack has come from sources opposed to democracy. Where democracy has been overthrown, the spirit of free worship has disappeared. And where religion and democracy have vanished, good faith and reason in international affairs have given way to strident ambition and brute force." Though he said that nearly 80 years ago, it has 100% proved to be true even during the last 80 years. True by history itself. Look, the real reason the Ten Commandments threaten so many folks is our culture assumes a higher authority, themselves. After all, they are the 10 Commandments, as Ted Koppel, a famous newscaster in the late 20th century, once said, not the 10 suggestions. The word commandments suggest a commander. There's a reason they were given, and there's a reason they are still valid today. Look at the first two verses of Exodus chapter 20. Then God gave the people all these instructions. I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. So the people who received these commandments obviously had a relationship with God. He was their creator. He was their redeemer. Stories had been told of him for the last 400 years while people were living in Egypt. The Ten Commandments were the words spoken by their deliverer. Now this same God who worked 10 miracles to set them free from the wicked Pharaoh of Egypt is 3 months later going to give them 10 commandments to guard their hearts and minds for their future days. And here's the rub that some people have with the Ten Commandments. They don't like another person calling the shots in their life, even when it's God. Even when it's God. Deep down, many of us think, I want to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, how I want to do it, but I still want to go to heaven. That's what many of us think. Folks, God didn't give us the Ten Commandments to hem us in or to suppress our individual freedoms. He gave us these commandments because He loves us. And He knows that they help protect us and they help maximize our life. He knows that life goes better when you put it together according to the owner's manual. When you follow God's 10 words or sayings. Understand that God's moral and spiritual laws are just like the laws of nature. You can ignore them for a while, deny that they exist, disobey them, and get away with it sometimes for a long, long time. But not forever without consequence. Take the law of gravity. You can believe in it or not. It's your choice. But jump out a 10-story building and you'll discover it's true. I was listening many, many years ago. Did anybody ever used to listen any at all to J. Vernon McGee? He was a Bible teacher. You did? Really? Oh, a handful of people. Well, I'd listened to him on the way to the church office years and years ago, and he had a call-in show at the end of his devotional every day, and that particular week a plane had blown up over Los Angeles, and the wreckage landed in a schoolyard, injuring some children. And the caller wanted to know why God had allowed the kids to be harmed. And McGee told him it had to do with the law of gravity. And the caller argued, well, couldn't God have suspended the law of gravity? And J. Vernon McGee said with his southern drawl, yeah, but everybody else would have flown off the planet. And all the other planes would have come to the ground too. Violate the law of nature and you will suffer the consequences. The same thing is true with God's moral and spiritual law. Run roughshod over the 10 Commandments, and you may get away with it for a while, but eventually you'll experience harm and hardship and heartbreak. As Charles Spurgeon once said, God doesn't allow His children to sin successfully. And He doesn't. And you wouldn't expect Him to, or even want Him to. It reminds me of a man who lived in Boston, and he was visiting Mark Twain in St. Louis, and he told Twain that before he died, he wanted to travel to the Middle East and stand on top of Mount Sinai and recite from memory the 10 Commandments. And wouldn't that be a great and inspirational and spiritual thing to do? And Twain said, well, yes, it would, but I've got an even better idea. Why don't you just go back to Boston and live out the 10 Commandments? Because living out the 10 Commandments is a whole lot better than just memorizing them and saying them. The great Bible teacher, John MacArthur, provides us a wonderful way, I think, to see the 10 Commandments. He sees them as pictures of love, and he pairs them with the great definition of love given in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And he said, in the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you have no other gods before me. Love is being loyal. And then he went right down the list of the 10 Commandments and said, love is faithful. Love is reverent. Love is intimate. Love is respectful. Love is harmless. Love is pure. Love is unselfish. Love is truthful, doesn't bear false witness. Love is content. It's not greedy by pride trying to take other people's stuff. And so I would challenge you this afternoon or sometime this week to pull out the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and go down them one by one and compare them to MacArthur's list here. It's a beautiful definition of what the commandments are intended to do. They're intended to be a reflection of the love that God wants us to have for Him and for everyone else. I look around today in our society and I see a lot of hollow men and hollow women. People on the outside appear to be alive, but on the inside, they're just barely getting by. Appear to be stuffed with straw men, to say. They don't have any real conviction about anything. There's nothing in their life that is worth them sacrificing for. Nothing in their life that requires an absolute and total commitment from them. They drift day to day without an anchor, hoping for good luck. They're floating down the river with no moral compass, no spiritual compass, and may not even realize that you can only do that so long until you head for a waterfall. It's been said, a man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. So let me ask you in this introductory lesson this morning, because I wanted to have an introductory lesson to all the 10 Commandments, tell you how they were formed, why they were formed, give you a history of them before we actually jump into them one by one. Let me ask you some introspective questions as we close these thoughts this morning. What are the non-negotiables in your life? What are the standards in your life that never change regardless of the people you're with or the stress you are under or the peer pressure you receive? What are the non-negotiables and the standards that you stand solid as a rock upon? The 10 Commandments are calling us to such non-negotiables. Do your kids or grandkids see you as a chameleon? We know what those are like down here. A little animal that slithers around and blends in with its surroundings and color changes with its surroundings in order to protect itself? Or do your kids and grandkids see you as a true champion of what you really say you believe? Someone has said, the pressing need in America is not for guided missiles, but for guided morals. Guided morals are God's intention of the 10 Commandments. And it's time to reinstill the underpinnings, the foundations of society. And they were. Not only Israel's society at the foot of Mount Sinai, but read your American history. They were the underpinnings and the foundation of law, government, and right and wrong in America, in Western society. And they're there for a reason. Morality is not a guessing game. Spirituality is not a guessing game. Right and wrong are not up for grabs. True and false do exist. a customized morality that serves only our own selfish interest, isn't and never was part of God's plan. God gives us absolutes, truth for all time that stand the test of time. And over the next 10 or 11 weeks, as we roll through November and December into the first of the year, I pray that God will build character and conviction in my life as I study and develop these lessons, and in your life as you ingest them, so that we will enter the new year 2025 embracing the 10 non-negotiable commandments given us by God.